Today on the Perception and Action podcast, a look at the Yips. What exactly is it? How does it differ from choking under pressure? What effects does it have on movement coordination? And how can it be treated? So it's time for a call to action. Hi everyone, this is Rob Gray from Arizona State University and PerceptionAction.com. Welcome to the Perception and Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. In today's episode, I want to look at the phenomenon of the yips in sports. This is a topic that I've had several people ask me about recently. Up front, I'll admit it's something that I've always had interest in, but not really studied myself. So we might end up finishing today's episode with more questions than answers. But here we go. First off, what exactly do we mean when we use the term the yips? And how does it differ from choking under pressure? Well, these turn out to be more difficult questions to answer than one might think, because there's been a large amount of inconsistency in the definitions used. The key distinction between the yips and choking under pressure seems to be the presence of a focal dystonia in the former. The term focal dystonia refers to a neurological disorder characterized by sustained muscle contractions that result in spasms, twisting, and abnormal posturing of a specific body part. So, for example, one definition of the yips that is commonly used is an involuntary muscle contraction that manifests in jerks, tremors, or freezing, which disrupts the execution of fine motor tasks. Here is an example case description of someone with the yips. A right-handed professional golfer aged 62 years noticed that his left hand would turn inward when holding a golf club and putting. He felt a sensation of tightness over the dorsal aspect of his left thumb. On examination, he had no abnormalities in the upper limbs, except that when holding a golf club and putting, he had a noticeable pronation of the left hand, along with tightness of the bicep and forearm flexors. So, an important point here. The yips is an example of a task-specific movement disorder. That is, it's something that only occurs during certain activities, postures, or circumstances. A golfer with the yips typically does not have trouble picking up a coffee cup or driving a car, for example. The most common example of a task-specific movement effect that some older listeners, including myself, may have experienced is writer's cramps, where after doing a lot of handwriting, your hand gets sore, but typically only when you are writing. As we'll see in a second, this dystonia is sometimes, but not always, accompanied by psychological symptoms, for example, feelings of anxiety. Thus, there can be psychological, neurological, and physiological components associated with the yips. Smith and colleagues have proposed that we should be classifying yips-affected athletes on a continuum, anchored by pure focal dystonia symptoms, what they call type 1 yips, at one end, and pure psychological symptoms associated with performing under pressure, such as anxiety, at the other end, what they call type 2 yips. Another interesting complication in defining the yips is how the neurological and psychological symptoms relate to each other. Specifically, which comes first? Does high anxiety produce the tremors, or vice versa? Are the motor problems always associated with anxiety? The yips typically does occur more frequently in high-pressure competitive situations, but how do feelings of pressure and the dystonia relate to each other? Moving away from definitions for now, how common is the yips, and which sports does it affect? It has been observed in a wide range of sports including golf, see Bernard Langer, snooker, see Stephen Hendry, darts, see Eric Bristow, and baseball, see Mackie Sasser, whose case I discussed back in episode 19b. The yips manifests itself differently across different sports. For example, in darts and baseball, the problem tends to be at the point of release, where in golf and snooker, it's more about controlling the movement of the implement. An interesting example of a yips-type phenomenon, called Flikikammo, apologies for the wrong pronunciation most likely, has also been observed in gymnastics. This is where the athlete loses the ability to effectively do backward moving skills. By far, the most commonly studied cases of the yips have been in golf. The first known report of the yips in golf was in 1977, when Foster wrote an article describing quote-unquote putting agony. The term itself is believed to have been popularized by golfer Tommy Armour roughly 50 years ago, when he was forced to retire from golf as a result. The most common symptoms described by the yips-affected golfers are jerks. Other less commonly described symptoms are tremors, twitches, spasms, freezing, or a combination of these symptoms. Usually only one hand, typically the dominant hand, is affected by the yips, although it's not uncommon for both hands to be affected. How common is the yips in golf? There have been a wide range of estimates found in survey-type studies, ranging from 28 to 52% of golfers having experienced it at some point. This large discrepancy is most likely due to inconsistent definitions of the yips. Typically, it's been found that golfers that are older and have more years of playing experience are more likely to get the yips. Finally, one thing that we do know is that the yips is persistent and difficult to completely get rid of once a golfer gets it. In one study, it was estimated that 60% of yips-affected golfers experience remissions after it goes away. As Tommy Armour put it, quote, "Once you have 'em, you got 'em." What causes the yips? Several ideas have been proposed, but the two most common ones are that it's an overuse phenomenon, similar to writer's cramp, or that it's a result of anxiety. Turning to the anxiety idea first, there have been a few studies which seem to contradict this idea, that the yips is primarily a psychological anxiety-related disorder. As described in the systematic review published by Clark and colleagues in 2015, link in the show notes, there have been a few studies which have compared the personality characteristics of yips-affected and non-affected golfers. A total of 7 studies have looked at either trait or state anxiety and have found no significant difference between the two groups. Similar findings have also been reported for studies looking at neuroses and obsessional thoughts. So we don't seem to see any consistent differences for these general personality traits. Turning to psychological factors that are more directly related to sport, movement-specific reinvestment, which is a construct developed by Rich Masters, defined as the attempt to consciously control one's movement during skill execution by the application of explicit rule-based knowledge, has also been studied in relation to the yips. I talked about reinvestment back in episode 11. To date, there's been 2 published studies that have examined this, with neither finding that the score on the movement-specific or decision-specific reinvestment scales can predict the yips. Finally, there have been a few studies that have looked at focus of attention and conscious control of action. For example, in 2001, Bodden and Maynard found that yips-affected cricketers reported similar characteristics to what we see with choking under pressure. That is, a tendency to focus one's attention inwards to consciously control movement. A similar result was found by Philippin and Lombinger in 2012 with yips-affected golfers, with the bulk of participants reporting that they focus internally. So in sum, although it seems like there's some psychological factors like anxiety and an internal focus of attention that can occur in some cases of the yips, it does not seem to be the primary cause of it. Rather, it seems more likely they're the result of some other effects. Instead of it being a primarily psychological phenomenon like choking, the bulk of evidence seems to point to the yips being a movement disorder. Along with the descriptions of tremors and jerks I described a few moments ago, we can also look at research testing EMG activity in yips-affected golfers. 4 different studies have investigated this in golf, with all studies finding that yips-affected golfers had higher forearm, bicep, and tricep muscle activation than non-affected golfers. As a specific example, Adler and colleagues studied 25 golfers with and 25 without subjective complaints of the yips, using surface EMG and video. They observed that 15 of the 25 golfers with yips, or 60%, had involuntary movement of the right hand and forearm, whereas only 2 of the 25 golfers without it, or 8%, had involuntary movement. It was also found that 41% of golfers who had involuntary movement also had co-contraction of their wrist flexor extensor on EMG right before making the putt, as compared with only 18% of those without involuntary movement. This type of co-contraction is a characteristic feature of dystonia. A few studies have also looked at differences in putting kinematics and kinetics for yips-affected golfers. For example, in 2009, Marquardt distinguished the severity of the yips based on the strength of oscillations. That is, at least one excessive opening and closing action of the putter face during the putting stroke. Participants were grouped into heavy yips, those that had strong oscillations, and mild yips groups. Marquardt found that compared to non-affected golfers, heavy yips golfers rotated the putter face less at impact, lacked consistency regarding the angle of the putter face at impact, and experienced a significantly more inconsistent path arc. In contrast, mild yips-affected golfers had significantly longer backswing time to impact and increased duration of the backswing compared to non-affected golfers. In 2000, Smith and colleagues measured grip force when investigating putting in Yips-affected and non-affected participants. They found that Yips-affected golfers produced significantly greater grip force than those that were not affected throughout the whole putting stroke. In addition, they found that Yips-affected golfers had a faster heart rate at the point of contact with the ball than non-affected golfers. So in sum, there seems to be some clear motor, physiological, and biomechanical effects associated with the yips. So with all this in mind, how can the yips be treated? There have been several approaches that have been used. Because small involuntary movements get amplified due to the length of the club, or the moment arm if you're into biomechanics, in golf, one common way to deal with the yips has been to adopt a long belly putter that can be anchored against the stomach. But those are now illegal in professional golf. Some golfers have also been reported to develop sensory tricks to overcome the yips. For example, one golfer claimed that pressing on his right cheek and the back of his neck to counteract an involuntary head movement helped improve performance. But obviously we need much more evidence and information about this before making any conclusions. A few different drug-related treatments have also been used. In some cases, muscle relaxants like benzodiazepines have been used. But for focal hand dystonia, including the task-specific dystonia we see in sports like golf, it seems like the best treatment is Botox injections into the affected muscle areas. As a case study of the use of Botox, I recommend you check out the videos associated with the paper Yips and Other Movement Disorders in Golf, link in the show notes. The video, which you will have to download unfortunately, shows the golfer describing their symptoms and putting before and after a Botox treatment. Other interventions used to treat the yips include acupuncture and psychological treatments like emotional freedom technique and guided imagery. What does the research have to say about the effectiveness of different treatments? Well, there have been some studies done. Most have been case studies or with very small number of participants, and to date it's all been done on golf. Botox was used in 3 studies with a total of 5 participants with varying results. It also proved to be ineffective in longer term for all participants. Yips-affected golfers admitted to using prescription medications for symptom relief, with most of them using benzodiazepines. 85% reported no benefit from such treatment. In 2005, Rosted described a case in which acupuncture was administered to the head and wrists on 5 occasions to a golfer who suffered with the yips. The golfer's physical and psychological symptoms disappeared after the first session, and the participant did not experience any relapse during the follow-up sessions. In 2007, Bell and Thompson found that 5 sessions of guided imagery lasting 20 to 30 minutes had a positive effect on one golfer's performance over 3 testing periods, the latest being 60 days later. So while there seems to be a lot of different potential avenues for treating the yips, a lot more research is needed to evaluate them. So to sum up, where do we stand in terms of understanding the phenomenon of the yips? It's clear from this short review that the yips involves a mix of motoric and psychological effects. In their systematic review, Clark and colleagues suggest that the Smith Type 1 and Type 2 model of the yips should be extended to a 2-dimensional model to take these effects into account. The updated model includes athletes who have predominantly experienced physical symptoms of the yips as Type 1, focal dystonia, those who predominantly experience psychological symptoms of the yips as Type 2, choking, and those who experience both psychological and physical symptoms as Type 3, focal dystonia plus choking. One interesting effect that I haven't mentioned yet that seems to support this type of division is that Type 1 golfers experience heightened muscle activation in both high and low pressure environments, whereas for Type 2 golfers, muscle activation seems to be only influenced in high pressure environments, as we and other researchers have found in studies of choking in golf. Clark and colleagues propose that using this model will allow practitioners to effectively propose interventions based on the Yips type group. For example, pharmacological interventions are unlikely to be effective for those who suffer with Type 2 Yips symptoms only, whereas psychological interventions such as guided imagery may not be as beneficial for those suffering with Type 1 Yips symptoms. But either way, it seems like we have a long way to go towards understanding this complex phenomenon. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu, on Twitter @ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including an extra monthly episode and written transcripts, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep 'em coupled.
I hear the winter. Cut you